Welcome to the first of two videos that we've put together for you on the topic of alarm. It is the HISI faculty's desire and hope that you'll be able to understand what alarm is, know how it can benefit you, and how you can practically use it in your everyday school life by the end of these two videos. For this first video, we're going to be looking at that section on the left, the learning section, what's called the higher order thinking matrix, and you'll become very familiar with this table that you can see. In the next video, we'll start looking at how you can use alarm in your writing, and we'll be looking at the color coding of responses. But today, we'll just start with, on the left, the higher order thinking matrix. So what is higher order thinking? Well, instead of giving you a definition, it might be a little bit easier to come to some examples. So if you look at the examples at the bottom of your slide, you can see that it's fairly easy to remember your friend's name, isn't it? We'd consider that to be a lower order thinking task. But if you had to provide a justification for why you're friends with that person, well, that's more difficult, and that's a higher order thinking task. The second example says that it's easy to state which type of phone is your favorite or which type of food is your favorite even, but it's much more difficult to be able to give reasons why that food or that phone is your favorite. And that's what we're going to try and help you to be able to do today, to move from lower order thinking to higher order thinking when required. In HISI, we do a lot of writing, and it's the aim of these videos to help improve and optimize your writing. It can be quite frustrating to know the answer, but not be able to communicate it. And so by the end of these videos, we're hoping that you'll be able to more effectively communicate what you already know. So what exactly is alarm? Well, let's have a look at that table again that we were introduced to before. This is the higher order thinking matrix, and you can see that on the left is the very simple task, and as we keep going to the right, they get more and more difficult until finally we are evaluating. And so we'll be looking at how we can move between each of these different categories when required. Firstly, to name something is to simply just identify your idea. And as we saw before, that's quite easy to do. If you're asked to describe, well, then you need to be giving examples of that idea that you would have already named. To explain then is then to give the significance of those examples that you provided, in a little bit more detail perhaps. To analyze would be to compare and contrast, possibly between ideas that are competing with each other. To critically analyze then would mean that you would want to add positives and negatives to each of those ideas. And then finally, right at the end, to evaluate would be to reach a conclusion or come to a position on something. You need to say why you came to that position instead of another position. And this is much more difficult to do. If you're a note-taking person, this slide would be great to take notes from or to keep handy for you as a way of defining what it is that we've already looked at with each of these different categories. But let's now go through an example together, and you might want to keep this slide handy for you while you're doing the example. The question on the board is evaluate the range of phones available to consumers within the Australian market. We've already started you off by naming three different types of phones that would be competing with each other for your, I suppose, business. What I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and to then describe, that is to provide examples of these different categories of phones that we've provided for you. Once you've done that, we can see that there are a few different descriptions that we could give, and you might even have gone into slightly more detail than what we've provided with you. Now stop, look back at your sheet, understand what it is to explain, and then once you think you understand what it is to explain, I want you to add an explanation to each of these different categories. Once you've done that, we can have a look at the explanation. Not only gives a little bit more detail, but it tells us about the examples that we've already provided for each of the categories. We can see that the smartphones, for instance, have applications that can help us organize things, that the original design phones actually have the talk and text feature without too much else, and that the phablet is a larger device which has many of the same applications as a smartphone. Now we get to the more difficult section of the table, and we start by analysing. So look back at that slide that we saw before with the different definitions of what analyse is. Do your analysis on the smartphones, original design phones and phablets, and then we'll have a look at what we've got on the screen. Now that you've done that, we can have a look at the analysis provided for us here. That actually maybe smartphones are really professional and can be useful at organising our personal lives. The original design phones are maybe just quite simple for people who maybe don't like the extra detail in the smartphones. And that phablets have that, I suppose, more creative aspect to them. Now critically analyse each of these categories by adding positives and negatives. Now that you've done that, we can look at some of the positives and negatives that you might have come up with, and perhaps you could have come up with many more than this. It's certainly not limited to what's on the screen. And finally, what we want to do is evaluate the different categories of phones that are available on the Australian market. This is the most higher order thinking task that we're going to ask you to do for this particular example. I'll let you have a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so what you may have come up with is a position on which type of phone you think would be best to use. Now, in this particular example, there was no objective right or wrong. You would be offering a subjective criteria, but based on that criteria that you've offered, you would need to have come to a position. Which type of phone is best, do you think, for the Australian consumer? And you would need to provide reasons why. In this particular example, we've said that the phablet is the best of the three options because it has the functionality of the smartphone, but is bigger and has that extra creativity involved as well. Now, this is all part of what we call command terminology. This is difficult to understand, but whenever you're asked a question, it's going to have a command term. Let's have a look at these questions here. You can see already, and you might have started to understand the color coding sequence by yourselves, but you can see that the top question, when it says state one impact of climate change, the state we've put in bold because that's the command term, and that's a lower order thinking task. You just simply have to identify one impact. Easy to do. In the blue, describe is the command term. It is a slightly more difficult but still lower order. And if we were to go right to the top, or right to the bottom as it would be on your screen, evaluate the effectiveness of the legal response to domestic violence. Evaluate is the command term and is a much higher order thinking task. Those red, blue and yellow sections, the state, describe and explain, this is lower order. It just uses your memory. It's not difficult to do if you've been listening in class. The higher order section down the bottom is much more difficult because it asks you to think for yourself, not just take what you've learnt in class, but to actually apply it with your own thoughts involved as well. This is higher order thinking. What I'd like you to do now is pause the video and have a look at each of these different categories: the name, describe, explain, analyze, critically analyze and evaluate, and take these command terms up the top and place them where you think they should go in each of these categories. Once we've done this, we'll see how you've gone. I'll assume that you've got that done now. On this slide, you can see some of those command terms and where we might put them in the alarm sequence, in the alarm matrix, I should say. The command terms are available for you on this link that you can go to, but have a look at how you did in your placement of those terms for each category and make any adjustments that you might need to make if you made some mistakes. Once you have this, it's really useful, isn't it, for when you get an assessment or when you're in an exam, because you can start to understand, well, at what level do I need to answer this question? Do I just need to state something or identify something, or do I need to actually start providing reasons for a position that I'm going to come to with an evaluate or justify question, for instance? So I hope you can start to see the usefulness of alarm. The last activity I'll get you to do in this particular video is to look at these 4 questions, and I'd like you to state if the question is a higher order or lower order question, and then place it on the alarm matrix and use those command terms in that table that you did in the previous activity to help you do that. Now that you've done that, we hope that you can see that alarm will be able to help you understand what the examiner is asking you to do in an assessment or in an exam. And you can actually use alarm along with Peel to develop your writing and engage in those higher order thinking questions. Now, in the next video, we're going to look at the different color codes that you've already seen. That for the lower order questions like name, describe, explain, we use the red, blue, and yellow. And for higher order, you can see that, well, I'm not even going to try and differentiate those 2 different colors, and then we end in the green for evaluate. And you'll be able to see how you can actually use those color codes to break down your own writing when you do drafts, but also to actually help you construct your Peel paragraphs.